I mean, that's the decisive terrain of this war is Crimea. And I'm talking about long-range precision capabilities that could, for example, make Crimea untenable. The Black Sea Fleet would have to leave if Ukraine had the ability to hit Sevastopol. I think the Russians are extremely unlikely to use a nuclear weapon. And even if they did use a tactical nuclear weapon, this is not something like Hiroshima or the final scene on Doctor Strangelove.
Thank you, General Hodges, for taking time to join us. You were head of U.S. Army Europe at one point in your career, and I want to ask you a really simple question. Did you ever think that Europe would be in the situation it's in right now with Ukraine being attacked by Russia and essentially this war unfolding that's happening right now?
JJ, I think a lot of us that watched Europe closely and watched Russia in particular realized after Russia's invasion of Georgia, the anniversary of which was yesterday, back in 2008, that this was a Russian government that was willing to use force in Europe against its neighbors. And then the fact that we in the West did nothing of significance in response to that worried me that this would invite further aggression by Russia. And then, of course, that continued with Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And again, we, the West, US, Canada, and Europe, really did nothing of consequence. You will remember that the height of the strategic debate was whether or not to provide javelin. I mean, that's kind of where we were. And so the Russians were pretty confident that we would not do anything back February last year when they launched their special military operation.
So, based on what you see right now, clearly there's been some changes in thinking in the West, but was it enough? Is it in time? Because we see what's taking place. We've seen Ukraine make some gains. We've seen Russia basically just not be able to do much, if anything, right in this war. But still, the West has dragged its feet on a few things. But I'm wondering, where does this war stand in terms of the possibility of Ukraine winning it?
So it absolutely is possible, and I would even say probable that Ukraine can win. The biggest obstacle, though, is us, the United States. The either the unwillingness or inability of the administration to declare what our desired strategic outcome for this war is. They should say, of course, that we want Ukraine to win, that it's in the interest of the United States and all of our European allies, indeed globally, that Ukraine wins, defeats Russia. But the administration's unwillingness or inability to actually say that contributes to this incremental decision making that we've been watching now for the past 18 months, and an unwillingness to provide certain capabilities that would, in fact, turn the tide in favor of Ukraine. And I'm talking about long range precision capabilities that could, for example, make Crimea untenable. The Black Sea Fleet would have to leave if Ukraine had the ability to hit Sevastopol regularly with long-range precision strike capability. That would, I mean, that's the decisive terrain of this war is Crimea, and I just think the administration is either unable or unwilling to do that right now.
Why do you think that is? I mean, I know unable and is one thing. You may not have an answer to that, but do you have an answer for why you think they're unwilling?
So the first responsibility of our political leadership, our civilian leaders, is to describe the outcome that they want. And then the military, the State Department, everybody else then comes up with a plan. Okay, this is how we do it. These are the requirements. These are the risks. We spent 20 years in Afghanistan and we only had a clearly defined outcome the first year. The next 19 years we spent without a clearly defined outcome. So this transcends multiple administrations, and then it ended in disaster. So I'm worried that we're in the same place, that the administration has not declared our outcome, the one that we want. Instead, they say we're with Ukraine for as long as it takes, which of course is an empty statement. That means nothing. Why is that? Of course, I'm an old retired guy. I have zero responsibility other than for myself and my wife, and I have no resources or authority to give. The president literally has the weight of the world on his shoulders. So I don't mean to be too cavalier or dismissive of the risks that he has to consider and the priorities he has to accept or determine. But I do think that the administration is overly concerned about the possibility of Russia using a nuclear weapon. Every time the president says no World War III, of course, nobody wants a World War III. But what he's saying is we're not going to do anything where Russia might feel that they can or have to use a nuclear weapon. I think the Russians are extremely unlikely to use a nuclear weapon. And even if they did use a tactical nuclear weapon, this is not something like Hiroshima or the final scene on Dr. Strangelove. Ukrainians have said, hey, if the Russians used a nuclear weapon on us, and they would be the most likely target, that's not going to stop us. But the Russians see that we, the West, are deterring ourselves out of this fear that they might use a nuclear weapon. And I think this is misguided policy. I also think that they're concerned, they don't know what happens if Ukraine wins and what happens in Russia. And that's a healthy concern. What does happen? Is Putin gone, or does he just change the narrative? And so I think there is concern about catastrophic victory by Ukraine.
So that's a really interesting point that you bring up. What happens if Ukraine wins? I'll get to that a little bit more in just a moment. But first, I want to ask you, give me your assessment of how you think Ukraine is doing right now, especially considering the conditions in the South and the East right now. I know landmines are a huge issue right now. There are other issues as well, not just there, but in the war in general. But give me your sense of how you think they're doing right now.
So, of course, all of us would like to see, or at least everybody that supports Ukraine would like to see Ukraine's counteroffensive going faster and with less casualties. That's obvious. Having said that, I have to give the Russians credit. They did not waste the several months that we gave them while we were arguing about whether or not to provide tanks and whether or not to provide more long-range weapons and all of this. They were busy digging trenches and putting in minefields. And so even though their Navy and Air Force and Army are operating independently of each other, there is no joint operational commander for Russian forces. They've got terrible problems of their own. Nonetheless, they do have mass, and the Ukrainians are having to deal with that. So the way that you neutralize the advantage of mass is by going after artillery and headquarters. That's the only advantage the Russians have, is mass. So by destroying Russian artillery and the ammunition stockpiles for that artillery, it takes a lot of pressure off of the Ukrainian troops who are trying to breach these minefields. Because when you're stopped at a minefield and you're trying to clear it, that's when you're most vulnerable to incoming artillery. So the Ukrainians have to be able to go after Russian artillery and Russian logistics. And for that, they need more longer range capabilities. And the other thing they want to do, of course, is to go after headquarters because of this centralized command and control system used by the Russians. If you can destroy headquarters, it reduces significantly the effectiveness of the Russian units that are in those defenses. That's how you neutralize it, but it takes time and it takes long range capabilities. Ukrainians are the best of any army of any country I've ever seen at adaptation of integrating new technology, but also adapting to what's happening in front of them. And I think they realized early on that they were going to have to change the tactics that they wanted to use in order to create openings in these defenses.
So, given what you see, given what we've all witnessed from February 24th up to this day, and also looking at what we've seen from Russia, which is the unwillingness to stop this war, What do you think it would take then for Ukraine to achieve decisive victory? I mean, you've talked about the Sevastopol piece of this, and you've talked as well about the military, the headquarters and the artillery, etc. But then there are other pieces of it that's kind of spread out. You know, you see what took place, these exercises with China, where they decided, okay, let's go over to Alaska and harass the US. How do you put this military in a position where they can't do any of that?
So when you look at a map, you realize quickly that Crimea is the decisive terrain of this war. I mean, the Russians, they don't really care about Luhansk and Donetsk, except that that gives them land access to the Crimean Peninsula. It's the land bridge. The other connector to Crimea, of course, is the Kerch Bridge, which we already can all see how vulnerable it is. So the Russians need this sort of land bridge that runs from Rostov through Mariupol, Melitopol down into Crimea. If and when Ukraine is able to liberate Crimea, Russia loses this unsinkable aircraft carrier that it has now for launching attacks all along Ukraine's southern coast and into the interior. It loses the ability to disrupt or block all 5 of Ukraine's major seaports. Mariupol and Berdansk, even after they are liberated, will still be unusable because Russia blocks access into the Sea of Azov with its control of Crimea. And then the other 3 ports, Odessa, Mykolaiv, and Kherson, are either blocked or disrupted by Russian forces operating from Crimea. So the Ukrainians know that they'll never be safe or secure as long as Russia occupies Crimea, and they'll never be able to rebuild their economy because their 5 main ports needed for export of grain and other materials are blocked or controlled by the Russians. And so they have to figure out how to liberate Crimea. And I think they do this, number one, by isolating it with land forces, but also by striking the bridges that connect Crimea to the land, and then making it untenable. If they have a weapon that can go 300 kilometers, the Black Sea Fleet has to leave. It can't sit there in Sevastopol. It would have to reposition about 400 kilometers to the east to Novorossiysk. And Novorossiysk is much less capable of being a home base for the Black Sea Fleet than is Sevastopol. So this is the approach. Once they've done that, the hundreds of miles of Russian trenches become much less important.
General Hodges, thank you very much. I really appreciate your taking time to talk with us today, explaining some very complicated and important issues to us. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for the privilege, JJ.